Farming and agriculture are a $12 trillion industry that keeps the world fed with all sorts of high-tech equipment and tools available. But back in the medieval times, peasants weren't so lucky. They had no machines, no fertilizers, and definitely no scientific knowledge. So how on earth did they manage to grow more food while actually working less? Sounds impossible, right? But medieval farmers had a few clever tricks up their sleeves. Their ways may be primitive, but were surprisingly smart enough to boost harvests without breaking their backs. Medieval farmers used the reliable two-field method, where they'd farm one field while letting the other rest or lie fallow so it could recover its nutrients with time. This meant only half of their land was producing food at any time, but around the 8th or 9th centuries, farmers in northern Europe started dividing their land into 3 sections, and the so-called three-field system was born. Here's how it worked. They'd plant one field with wheat or rye, which are winter crops, the second with oats, barley, or legumes, which are spring crops, and leave the third fallow. Every year, the fields rotated. This not only kept the soil from wearing out, but also added nitrogen through legumes and reduced the risk of total crop failure, although they probably didn't realize this at the time. Thanks to this system, food production went up, and peasants didn't have to work twice as hard. More food meant better health, higher populations, and, believe it or not, a bit more free time. But even with smart crop rotation, medieval fields were still stubborn. The soil was thick and heavy, especially in northern Europe, and that's where the plow comes in. Early farmers used wooden plows, which were fine in lighter Mediterranean soil, but try dragging one of those through the dense, clay-heavy earth, and you'd probably get stuck before breakfast. That's why the introduction of the heavy plow around the 6th or 7th century changed everything. This wasn't just any plow. It had a moldboard, a coulter, and a plowshare. It was like a medieval equivalent of upgrading from a bicycle to a pickup truck. The coulter was a vertical blade that sliced through the soil. The plowshare followed behind to cut the soil horizontally, and the moldboard flipped the soil over neatly, burying weeds and bringing fresh nutrients to the surface. Farmers could now till deeper and make use of rich but previously unusable land. Northern Europe suddenly had a farming advantage, and countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern parts of France began to thrive. Of course, pulling these heavy plows took quite a bit of muscle, but the payoff was way more efficient farming, and fields that were once useless now bursting with crops. With heavy plows tearing up the soil more efficiently, the next big question was, how do you pull them? For a long time, powerful animals like oxen were the go-to choice. They were strong and steady, yes, but slow. That changed when horses entered the scene. While horses had been around for ages, they weren't used for heavy farm work because the old Roman-style harnesses were all wrong and pressed against their throats and literally choked the animal. But in the 9th century, Northern Europe introduced the horse collar. This simple yet genius invention sat around the shoulders instead, letting horses pull with full power and no choking involved. Add in iron horseshoes for grip and protection, and suddenly horses were plowing fields nearly twice as fast as oxen. They needed better food, sure, but they also worked longer and covered more ground. For many villages, switching to horses was a total game changer. And as more land got farmed and more food filled the barns, farming itself began to shift from a solo survival grind to something bigger. In the medieval world, farming wasn't just a personal job, it was a community affair. You didn't own a whole field, you owned strips within a big open field shared by the village. This system, called the open field system, was incredibly common in Europe from the 9th to the 18th century, especially in places like England, France, and Germany. The idea was simple. Everyone in the village had access to long, narrow strips of land spread out across different large fields. These strips were rotated yearly, often following that three-field system we talked about earlier. This helped to spread out the risk. If one area had bad soil or got hit by pests, no single family would lose everything. But the real magic came from the teamwork. Plowing, planting, and harvesting were often done together. Villagers shared tools, labor, and animals. As a result, it was less every man for himself and more we're all in this muddy field together. Even responsibilities like mending fences or managing grazing rights on common pastures were decided collectively in village meetings. And just like medieval villagers worked together to grow more with less, we can grow this channel with a little teamwork too. So give this video a like and be sure to subscribe. It helps us reach more curious people like you. Now let's continue. With villagers farming side by side, managing shared land also meant protecting it, and that's where the humble hedgerow comes in. At first glance, a hedgerow might just look like an overgrown bushy mess, but in the medieval world, it was a mini eco-fortress. These natural barriers, made of dense shrubs, trees, and thorny plants, marked the boundaries between fields and kept animals from wandering where they shouldn't, because no one wanted to wake up to their neighbor's goat eating their crops. But beyond just fencing things in, hedgerows were secret weapons in pest control. They attracted birds and small animals like hedgehogs and toads that loved snacking on insects. Farmers also raised chickens, ducks, and geese, not just for the eggs and meat, but as natural bug zappers. Chickens would scratch up larvae, ducks gobbled slugs, and geese were basically medieval lawnmowers. The diversity in plants and flowers within hedgerows also helped. Certain wildflowers attracted pollinators like bees, while others repelled harmful bugs. Instead of chemicals or sprays, nature handled pest control for them with a little balance and biodiversity. But pests weren't the only problem. Weeds were another big enemy, and those took real muscle to manage. Without herbicides and industrial equipment, medieval farmers had to rely on pure strategy and sore backs to fight weeds. One clever method they used was high-density planting. By sowing crop seeds close together, the plants themselves formed a canopy, blocking sunlight from reaching the soil. No sunlight meant fewer weeds sprouting up in the first place. Still, some weeds were just a little too stubborn. So when dense planting didn't do the job, out came the tools. The hand mattock, a short-handled, hoe-like tool, was one of the most common. And by hoe I mean tool, not the other thing. It let farmers dig up deep roots without tearing up their crops. Then there was the weeding hook, a curved blade perfect for slicing up the soil and yanking weeds out by the root. Weeding never was a glamorous job, and it still isn't, but it was critical. If they let weeds take over, the whole harvest could suffer. So between tight planting, careful hand tools, and community effort, medieval farmers managed to keep their fields neat enough to feed growing populations. Just try to imagine that they did all that without a single bottle of weed killer. My, how we have changed in comparison to our forebears. Even with the best tools and teamwork, there was still one thing medieval farmers couldn't control: the weather. But what they could do, and did, was learn from it. They watched the skies, listened to frogs, and noticed when flowers bloomed or birds migrated. Nature was their calendar. During the medieval warm period from about 950 to 1250 AD, milder weather allowed them to grow more crops in new areas. Still, things could turn quickly, so they spread out the risk by planting different crops and building raised beds. It wasn't backed by modern science, but it was smart, local wisdom that helped them survive unpredictable seasons, and a lot of that knowledge still makes sense today. In farming, water is life, but too much of it is a disaster. Medieval fields had to walk a fine line between too dry and too soggy, especially in low-lying or rain-heavy regions like England, the Netherlands, and parts of Germany. So how did they manage it? With some seriously clever water engineering, mostly by hand. Drainage ditches were one of the most essential tools. These narrow channels were dug along the edges of fields to redirect excess rainwater and prevent crops from drowning. Some regions even built entire networks of ditches to move water from field to stream. It wasn't pretty, but it was effective and absolutely vital during wet seasons. In places where the land was naturally swampy or flood-prone, farmers raised their planting areas above ground using mounds or ridges, and in drier regions, water was carefully stored and rationed. Rain barrels and small ponds were used to collect water, and in some areas, farmers even tried planting around seasonal floods to maximize soil moisture. Water management was one of the make-or-break skills of medieval agriculture. A well-dug ditch could mean the difference between a full harvest and a hungry winter. Raising crops was certainly a major part, but once the harvest was in, the job wasn't over, because growing food is one thing, but keeping it from spoiling is even more challenging. You know those big lovely refrigerators we rely on so much today? They didn't have those. Instead, granaries were common for storing grains like wheat and barley. They were raised off the ground to keep out dampness and rats, and had slatted floors for airflow. For root vegetables, farmers used clamps, basically big outdoor mounds covered in straw and soil, which acted like natural fridges. Meat was another story. Without refrigeration, they used salting and smoking to preserve it. Fish and pork often got buried in salt or hung above a fire to dry. Ashes from the hearth were sometimes used to coat food, creating a barrier against bugs and bacteria. Milk was turned into cheese and aged, sometimes wrapped in cloth or wax for protection. Even fermentation came into play, turning cabbage into sauerkraut and saving it for the winter. Just think for a moment. These folks were doing all of this without any YouTube tutorials or a single productivity app. In fact, if you whipped out a phone in those times, you'd have probably been burned at the stake as a witch. But that's what I call medieval efficiency. And if you're interested in learning more about medieval life, then check out this video on the channel where we talk about how medieval people preserved their food. See you there!